The tall buildings glowed neon. Arthur was rummaging around in the castle, saying that he would have to do it a little longer. Gray asked him to hurry up before anyone saw them. Arthur looked back at Nico. The brunette told him to just stand guard since he was almost done. Gray asked if he was sure that everything would be okay. Nico turned the door knob, saying that of course. He smiled happily, shouting for him to bow before his power. Gray asked in a whisper, could he be any louder? The brunette opened the door, whispering for him to bow before his power. Arthur rummaged around the house. The blonde opened a drawer, thinking that he had convinced himself that this was a necessary measure. The brunette shook out the jewelry into a bag with a smile. Gray noted that robbing someone, no matter how rich he was too much for him. The blonde looked in the mirror, thinking that the orphanage was at stake. He put the mirror in the bag, noting that they needed the money. Nico looked at his friend with a smile, asking if he was ready. Arthur with a serious expression said that he was ready and they could go. Night was spreading over the city. Arthur walked down an alley. Gray asked if they could trust that guy for sure and who would buy trinkets from 12-year-olds anyway. Nico said that he didn't ask questions, and he didn't ask questions, it was simple, and besides, he was paying in cash. There was a yellow light in the house. The brunette knocked on the door. He puffed out his cheeks. Nico made a pompous expression. A bald man opened the door. The brunette looked at the man with an arrogant expression. The man said that he was a stubborn kid and from what he saw, he had grabbed his friend. The brunette said that he was only there to carry the goods. Arthur walked into the building. The man told them to close the door behind them. Gray covered his nose with his hand from the acrid smoke. The brunette looked at his friend, saying that he would arrange everything and for now let him look around. Gray looked around the room. He looked at the smoking man with bewilderment. Nico looked at the man examining the jewelry with a smile. Gray picked up a book, wondering if it was an old Kai control technique. Gray flipped through the pages of the books. The blonde looked at his friend in fear. Nico asked if he found something interesting. The blonde said that he didn't at all. Arthur looked back at the man, who said that they could take it if they wanted. The bartender wiped the glasses, saying that no one present was able to read the writings and that it was only collecting dust. Arthur asked if this was true. The brunette spread his hands, looking at his friend. The bartender looked at Arthur leaving. Arthur walked in the heavy rain. Gray asked Nico if he would tell him why he had brought him along, noting that he seemed to be doing just fine on his own. Gray squinted and looked back. Nico smiled at his friend, saying that at least he got the book for free, asking if it wasn't more fun with two. Gray said that they were being followed. The blonde looked away, saying that they were the smokers from the store. Two guys were following Arthur. Gray looked straight ahead with a serious expression, saying that they needed to turn right at the next alley and then run. Arthur were running through puddles. They ran briskly down the alley. Gray climbed the wall while Nico was looking back. The blonde jumped to the ground while Nico was still climbing. The brunette plopped down, gritting his teeth. Gray said that they needed to run faster. Rain dripped through the puddles. Arthur hid behind a trash can. The blonde grabbed his friend by the backpack, telling him to stop. A man with a crazy expression on his face looked out from behind the dumpster, saying that he found them. Arthur looked at the villain in fear. The blonde pulled his friend towards him. Nico looked at the man in fear when Gray yelled at him to run. The blonde hit the man's hand with a stick. His eyes widened. Gray looked behind him, looking at his friend lying down. He clenched his teeth. Gray picked up the bag from the backpack in front of him, asking what they came for. The blonde was running away from his pursuers. He lowered his gaze. Then Gray looked to the side. The blonde stood with his back to the wall. He turned his head, looking at his pursuer. His mouth slightly opened. Gray kicked the can towards the man. The brunette tripped over the can, falling to the ground. The blonde bounced off the man's back, jumping towards the wall. The blonde landed on the ground. He noticed the villain's reflection in a puddle. The man swung his fist at Arthur, calling him a nimble little brat. Gray's eyes flashed as he swung his fist. He punched his pursuer in the face. The brunette walked up to his comrade, looking at him in confusion. Arthur were breathing heavily, having broken away from the men. Nico grinned and poked Gray in the shoulder. He said that's why he didn't go alone, saying if he could see himself, fluttering around like those kings and duels. Gray looked away in confusion, saying that he didn't even realize what he did and everything suddenly became so slow. Nico remembered Gray holding a lot of plates. He said that it was the same when Pavia threw plates, noting that he caught so many and didn't bat an eye. Gray sarcastically noted that this had everything to do with the fight. Nico sighed heavily, saying that he would understand soon. The door creaked open. Nico said that they had to get inside before anyone woke up. Arthur walked up the stairs quietly. Nico's eyes widened in horror when he heard a loud creak. He looked at Gray, pressing his finger to his lips. Gray apologized to the brunette. Arthur continued to walk up slowly. The headmistress asked Arthur if they could spare her a minute. Arthur looked away in fear. Nico said sure, asking them to wait a second. Gray asked his friend if he thought she knew. Nico said that he wanted to say that it was impossible, but they were talking about the sorceress. Arthur cautiously looked inside the office. The headmistress looked at Arthur with a menacing expression. The blonde looked at the sorceress in surprise. She said that she would like to introduce them to the new girl. The girl sat with her head down. The headmistress said it was Cecilia. Gray looked at the serious Cecilia. The headmistress said she was their age, hoping they could become friends. The bright rays of the sun shone on Arthur's face. Arthur opened his eyes. He sat up from the bed. Arthur stroked the sleeping Sylvie, thinking that he had not dreamed of his past life for a long time. He looked away with a sleepy look. Arthur was sitting on the bed, looking out the window. Arthur continued to sit motionless when there was a knock on his door. The mage said that they could come in. Arthur began to get up from the bed when a fighter stood in front of him. Arthur said that the meeting place had been finally decided. Arthur stood in front of the mage with a menacing look, saying that the Varian commander asked to begin preparations. Arthur asked what kind of preparations. Arthur and the fighter looked away. The maids entered the room, holding clothes in their hands. The maids bowed shyly. Sylvie asked Arthur if any of the young ladies who seemed to be into him had caught his eye, or if he was only interested in princesses. The mage looked at Sylvie with irritation, telling her not to think that he wouldn't kick her in front of all those people. Arthur went out into the hallway. Arthur changed into a nice outfit. Varian said how annoyingly good he looked in that outfit. The old man put his arm around Arthur, telling him to remind him to take a couple of photospheres of him later so that he would have a bribe for Tessa. Arthur said that they should have come up with a more comfortable uniform. Alder looked back, saying that it was time to move on. The guys went through the gate. Arthur followed the old man. He thought that Varian had probably calmed down a bit after the death of the headmistress Sylvie, noting that he was strong, as it should be. Arthur went outside, where a beautiful sunset was visible. The mage thought that even he was worried about how Vritra got to the headmaster, and it was scary to imagine what Varian was going through. The commander looked back with a serious look, asking if he was ready to meet with the Vritra representatives. Arthur looked at the old man with a serious look. He asked if he was ready, noting that he knew he was eager to find the killers of headmistress Sylvie. The old man closed his eyes and smiled. He suggested that he focus on returning safe and sound, adding that his granddaughter would bury him alive if anything happened to him. Arthur smiled slightly. The mage approached the old man with a wide smile, saying that as if he wasn't the first to get hit. Varian said that was all the more reason to return safe. Varian looked back, saying that it was time to go. The lord and the commander approached the cliff. Then they jumped down. Arthur approached the cliff. He jumped into the air. Sylvie jumped down, emitting a purple aura. The lord and the commander were floating in a golden sphere. Purple lightning appeared in space. A huge dragon was hovering above the sphere. Arthur was riding Sylvie's black dragon. The guys were hovering above the ground. They were moving rapidly across the sky. Arthur looked straight ahead with a serious expression. Sylvie looked back at Arthur, asking if he was okay. Arthur said that everything was fine, noting that he still couldn't get used to her calling him by his name. Sylvie raised her head proudly, saying that her grandfather had said that she should maintain her dragon dignity. Arthur said that he was sure that he had told her a lot. The mage looked down with narrowed eyes. He remembered standing in front of the golden gates. The gates swung open in front of Arthur. Arthur thought that on his last day of training in Ephiatus, Lord Indrath had called him to him. Arthur stood with a menacing look. He thought that nothing could surprise him anymore. Arthur's eyes widened. He stood with his back to the Lord. The mage's mouth dropped open in surprise. Meyer closed her eyes and smiled widely. The Lord said that he was sure that he was acquainted with his wife Meyer. The girl greeted Arthur. Indrath rested his head on his hand, saying that without Meyer's help, there would be no point in them practicing. Meyer said that she had only given him a little guidance, nothing more. Arthur stood with his back turned, looking ahead. He thought that Meyer's appearance had definitely shocked him. Indrath raised his hand. Arthur looked ahead in shock. Arthur noted that after hearing Lord Indrath's last message, he had to rethink everything he had been working on. The mage looked at Winsome and confused. The Lord looked at Arthur with a serious expression. The Lord glared at the mage, saying that he hoped that he would take his advice seriously. Indrath's mouth dropped open slightly. Virion looked at Arthur, saying that they were almost there, adding that they should be on guard. The old man shook his head, saying that he still thought that coming to that meeting with such a small group was a bad idea. Alder said that if the envoy did anything against them, he would have every right to intervene. Arthur were floating in the golden sphere. Alder said that considering everything Vritra had done before, breeding half-breed Azuras, creating mutants, and now ships, the commander looked into the distance with a serious look. He said that he could not imagine how long Agrona had been planning this, adding that for him this war was just a game. Alder looked at the old man with a serious look. He said that as long as Agron was forbidden to personally participate in the war, he had decided to be the all-powerful hand moving the pawns on the chessboard, at least his pieces. Alder pressed his lips together. Virion asked who was in control on their side. The old man stared straight ahead. The Lord asked if he was the one leading this war, was he not? The commander stood with his back to the distance, saying that at least that was what he told himself at night. Arthur continued to move above the ground. The Lord raised his head, looking at Arthur, saying that it would be better if he and Sylvie came down and were with them. Sylvie looked at Arthur with a serious expression. She said that she would lie low for now, but she would not hide during the war, and if she wanted to protect him, she would put him on her back. A purple aura began to emana from the dragon. Arthur jumped into a golden sphere. Arthur hovered over the water, where ships were visible. Sylvie told them to look. Arthur looked down, saying that he did not think that these were simple messengers. Arthur landed on the ship. On the ship, they were met by messengers, greeting Arthur in their humble abode. The messengers looked at Arthur with a menacing expression. They stood opposite each other. Alder said that they thought that they would meet simple messengers, and it seemed that this role was unworthy of them. The messengers said he was flattered, but that was the role they were playing at the time. The brunette pressed his hand to his chest, saying he was Silrit and this was Yudo, adding that it was an honor to greet Alder. Arthur looked at the messenger in surprise. Silrit said that they, the vassal, had heard a lot about the famous Azuras Ephiotis. Arthur wondered what vassals they were. Silrit looked at the guys with a serious expression, asking that he hoped they would keep their agreement and come unarmed. The Lord looked at the messenger with a serious expression, saying that of course, asking that he believed they had also kept that agreement. Yudo smiled bloodthirsty, saying that it was understandable why Mr. One-Eyed and the elven grandfather were there, adding that he did not expect that they would be honored with the presence of the Wonder Boy. Arthur Lewin. The mage glared at the messenger, saying that he could say the same about them, asking why they were honored to see the faces of the servants there. Yudo smiled maliciously, standing before the mage. He noted that, as Silrit had said, they were there as messengers, adding that he did not want to endanger an innocent servant who they could seize and torture for information. The messenger smiled bloodthirsty, saying that he would have done just that. The messenger looked at Silrit with a wide smile. The brunette told Yudo to stop. Yudo said that the one-eyed man could not do anything to them anyway. Alder said that he did not want to. The brunette stared ahead with a cold gaze. Alder frowned, saying that since they were not there to exchange pleasantries, he suggested that they return to their message. Silrit said as he wished, noting that their supreme overlord had asked him to convey only this to the Dikatham leaders. Arthur stood on a small platform. Silrit said that the ruling families should surrender, and mercy would be granted to those who deserved it. But if they continued to resist, their army would exterminate all inhabitants of the continent, without exception. Varian clenched his hand into a fist. The old man glared at the Nico messengers, asking what they called conditions. Varian pulled his hand away, saying that it was an ultimatum. Yudo told them to be grateful that they had any choice. The messenger smiled bloodthirsty, telling them not to worry, adding that if they chose the first option, he would try to be as gentle as possible while cutting off their heads. Silrit glared at the messenger, saying that they were not there to provoke a fight. Yudo said that he had no intention of doing so, but merely gave a friendly warning of the upcoming battle. Yudo stuck out his tongue, saying that Varian and his granddaughter would make sure to enjoy this while he watched. Arthur drew his sword, gritting his teeth. Varian struck the messenger in the face. The old man looked at the smiling Yudo with fury. The messenger smirked when his hood fell, saying that it tickled. Arthur's eyes widened. He saw one broken horn on his head. Arthur remembered with horror Aaliyah dying at his hands. Arthur approached the messenger, asking that it was him. Varian looked at the guy in bewilderment. Yudo asked what he was talking about. The mage asked if it was he who killed Aaliyah. Yudo looked at the guy menacingly. The mage said that the spear that was in the dungeon, the one whose limbs he cut off before killing. The mage looked at the messenger with a wild look, asking that it was him. Yudo looked away thoughtfully. He bared his teeth, looking up, asking about the severed limbs, noting that there were quite a few of them. The messenger smiled bloodthirsty, asking that it was that cute little elf. Yudo looked at the mage with a malicious smile, asking what now, even if it was him. Arthur pursed his lips. Varian put his hand on Arthur's shoulder. He looked at Arthur with a serious look. Sylvie touched the mage's leg with her paw. Arthur closed his eyes. The messenger looked at the mage with bewilderment. Arthur asked if there was anything else they needed to discuss. Yudo grinned maliciously. Arthur asked if this predictable threat was all they were there for. Silrit looked at the guys with a serious look, saying that they were given 2 days to think about it. Varian glared at the messenger. Silrit said that if the royal families had not surrendered by then, they would take that as an answer. Yudo smiled sarcastically. Arthur said that they would go then. Arthur headed back with a dejected look. Arthur squinted down. Arthur widened his eyes. Yudo told the mage that he simply had to hear her scream. Yudo smiled bloodthirsty, looking away. He said that he almost didn't want to kill her because if he had left her alive, he would have been able to enjoy such beautiful screams longer. Arthur looked behind him, lightning flashing in his hand. The mage directed a pillar of electrical energy towards the messengers. Yudo looked at the mage with a sly grin, saying that it was impressive. The pillar of energy struck the sea. Yudo said that it was a cute trick. Arthur looked at the messengers with a menacing look. He walked ahead of the lord and the commander, telling the messengers that he looked forward to seeing them on the battlefield. There were dead monsters lying in the cave. The girls were casting spells over the monsters, raising them into the air. Angela and Tesha were tying up the monsters. Adam was looking at the monster thoughtfully. Darvis and Stannard were tearing off the fangs of the monsters. The fighter shouted at them not to damage the horns and fangs while cutting them out. Darvis exhaled tensely. The fighter said that if they were going to make weapons out of them, they had to keep them whole. Darvis stomped on the monster, displeased. He asked what the hell they were doing there, noting that all that was left was no more valuable than the cores of these beasts and the parts of an S-rank beast. Stannard looked at his partner dejectedly, saying that this time he would have a hard time disagreeing with him, adding that no cannonballs meant no ammo for his weapon. The green-haired boy looked up in confusion. He asked how Arthur's bond had managed to absorb all those cannonballs, adding that he told him he had taken a couple for himself. Stannard said that now, as usual, he would have to disagree with him. The green-haired boy pointed at the corpses of the monsters, asking why they were so neatly stacked on top of each other. Stannard looked at his partner in confusion. Darvis asked if this guy, Arthur, had stacked them like that to look cool. Stannard said that in fact, these corrupted mana beasts could be so insane that they began to climb over the corpses of their own kind in an attempt to get their prey. Darvis said that he understood everything. The green-haired boy looked at the blonde with annoyance, saying that he wasn't that stupid and would eventually run out of fun facts like that. Stannard's eyes widened. The blonde looked at the shaking rock, asking his partner if he could feel it. Darvis said that it was probably just a fallen beast. Helen looked straight ahead. Tessa walked up to the archer, asking if they were almost done there. The archer said she thought so, noting that everyone was working slower since there was less loot to share in this raid. Adam walked up to Helen with a big smile, saying that on the other hand, they didn't have to get their hands dirty. Helen said she thought he was right. Tessa looked at Arthur with a smile, asking what they were going to do after this raid. Helen said that they would return to Xyrus to resupply and then head to their next dungeon near Blackbin. Tessa sighed heavily, saying that she and her party would head back to the floating castle and wait for the next task, adding that they had been there much longer than any of them expected. Adam closed his eyes and smirked, saying that it was not worth being too upset if they had a chance to rest. Korea and Jasmine looked ahead in surprise. Adam said that he hoped that they could rest too, even if only for a short time. Durden stood near a wall that emitted a green glow. Durden looked at the wall thoughtfully. Jasmine asked what he found. Durden said that the structure of the wall there was slightly different. The wall in front of the guys began to crack. Durden looked at the guys in fear, telling them to run. A crowd of monsters burst out from behind the wall, stood ready for battle. The monsters began to attack the people. The archer shouted that they needed to get everyone out of there. The fighters fought with their opponents. Darvis bared his teeth, looking behind him. The monster hit Darvis with his club, flew to the side. Tessa bent over the ground, causing green roots to appear from there. Helen began to aim her magic bow. She attacked the monsters tied with vines, and suddenly, a monster appeared in front of the archer. The girls managed to dodge the blow. Tessa gritted her teeth, wondering how Arthur dealt with so many on his own. Darvis blocked the beast's arm with his axes. He bared his teeth, telling his arms to move. Korea attacked the monster in the head. She looked at Arthur in confusion, asking what was wrong with him. Darvis said that he still did not have full control of his arms after Arthur injured him. Tessa looked back at Arthur, telling them to go to the door and take as many soldiers as possible with them. Korea and Darvis rushed to the door. Jasmine blocked the monster's path, drawing her blades. The brunette jumped off the ground. She briskly cut the monsters with her blades. Darvis and Korea were taking the people out. Angela and Standard were protecting the people. Attacked the approaching monsters. Adam cut the monsters with his spear. Adam stood in a circle of beasts. He squinted at his opponents. An explosion occurred behind the red-haired guy. He looked behind him, looking at the bodies of the monsters. The red-haired guy looked at Durden with a smirk. Durden looked ahead with a serious expression. Adam said that he owed him. Durden noted that he would thank him later. The monster opened its mouth wide. Durden said that they had a bigger thing there that needed to be taken care of. Green vines appeared. The vines protected from the monster's attack. Durden looked at the beast in shock, saying that it was a huge target. Arthur looked back at the archer. Helen said that they were in their debt now. Helen looked at Arthur with a smile. The beast grabbed the vines, tearing them apart. The monsters broke through the defense. Adam swung his spear at the monsters. Adam pierced the beast's head with the spear. Helen pulled an arrow into the bowstring. She attacked with multiple arrows at the monsters. Adam looked at the archer with a smirk, asking her to leave something for them. The archer said that he should be quicker. The monster pinned Durden to the ground. The spearman rushed towards his comrade, shouting at the monster to take his paws off him. The spearman swung his weapon. He threw it at the monster, piercing it. Adam picked up Durden, looking at him in fear. Adam dragged Durden along, saying that they needed to leave. Durden looked ahead in horror. Helen blocked the monster's mouth with her bow. Adam widened his eyes, telling Helen to be careful. On the other side, the monster was flying towards the archer. Helen widened her eyes, seeing a silhouette in front of her when claws appeared. Tesha looked ahead in shock. The sun was shining above the floating castle. There were guards at the teleportation gate. The guys appeared from the gate. Arthurs looked at Varian in bewilderment. He asked that he would not seriously consider their offer. The old man said that he would not. The old man looked down with a sad look, saying that if they had kept their word, many innocent lives could have been saved. Arthur looked at the old man worriedly, saying that it was too big enough to sacrifice himself and his family. Alder said Arthur was right. The Lord looked at the worried commander, saying that even Ephiatus was not immune to conflict. The Lord added that it was only a matter of time before they attacked the remaining Azura in a couple of generations. The old man looked ahead worriedly, saying that he knew. The mage looked at the commander's back. Varian said that although he would not mind if it went without the protests that would surely start after his decision was announced. The mage asked what he was going to tell everyone. Varian lowered his head. He looked ahead with a serious look. The commander said that trust was a fickle thing, hard to earn, but so easy to lose, adding that a leader needed people to trust him, asking how he thought they would trust him if they realized that he was essentially playing with their lives like chips in a game of chance. Arthur looked down with a downcast gaze. Arthur turned his head away. He said that if his plan was based on him telling everyone, then they would have a say, asking what he would do if they decided to sacrifice their leaders. Arion looked down with concern. He said that the time had passed when kings chose the path for their people, and this war would affect everyone. They too needed to make a choice. Arthur looked into the distance with a sad look. He closed his eyes and yawned widely. Sylvie looked away with a smile, telling Arthur to look. Arthur's younger sister was standing in the garden. Sylvie said that it was Ellie. Ellie smiled confusedly. Sylvie told Arthur that she looked a little. Arthur looked unfounded at what was happening. Ellie raised her eyebrows, smiling awkwardly. The guy with long hair beamed with joy. He noted that he had told his father back then that the fire main was not a strong enough bond for a genius like him. Boo glared at the guy behind him. The blonde said that given his current level, he needed someone at least as high as a world lion like Prince Curtis. The blonde widened his eyes as Boo grabbed him. The bear threw the guy into the sky in irritation. The blonde said that her connections seemed to like him. Ellie looked at Boo with displeasure, saying that he couldn't throw everyone he didn't like. The brown-haired girl looked away in surprise. Arthur waved his hand at his sister. The brown-haired girl happily hugged her brother, saying that he had returned. Arthur looked at the people around him in confusion, asking why everyone was looking at him like that. Ellie said that there wasn't a single noble in Dickathon who didn't know who Arthur Lewin was. Boo stamped his paw. He looked at the mage with a menacing look. Arthur looked at the bear with a menacing look. Arthur and the bear shook hands. The mage said that he was glad to see him. Ellie looked at her brother in bewilderment, asking when they had managed to become so close. The mage said that men with the same goals tend to find common ground quickly. Ellie said that in any case, it was good that he was there. Arthur looked at his downcast sister in surprise. Ellie said that he was the only one who could stop them. Ellie looked at her brother with a sad look. Arthur asked who to stop. The younger sister frowned, lowering her eyes. She looked at her brother excitedly, saying that it was Mom and Dad, noting that they had decided to join the war. The sun was shining above the floating castle. Arthur walked towards the doors. He recalled Ellie's words with a dejected look, wondering if he had the right to stop them from participating in that war. Arthur approached the door, thinking that objectively they would be great reinforcements. Arthur reached for the handle with a trembling hand. He looked down with a sad look. The mage thought that seeing them on the front lines, risking their lives, he would not want that, even if it looked too selfish on his part. Alice shouted that he could come in. Arthur opened the door. Arthur entered his parents' room. Sylvie jumped off Arthur's shoulder. Arthur reached for the armor. Mom said that they did not expect him to return so soon. Arthur looked sadly at the armor, asking if they were going to leave without telling him. Alice looked down sadly, saying of course not, they just wanted to get ready before he returned. Arthur stood there with a dejected expression. He looked away, saying that he thought they would wait until Ellie was older before doing something so risky. Ray looked at the floor, saying that the commander had advised them to wait until either Ellie was older or until he returned. Arthur looked at his father in shock, saying that he couldn't believe they were suddenly going to war just because he had returned, asking why then. Ray looked at the armor worriedly. He said that they had received a message from Helen, noting that they were being attacked as they were heading out. Arthur looked at his father in horror. Arthur looked at his father in fury, saying that it was impossible since he had been away for so long just the day before. Arthur noted that he had cleared the dungeon and killed the S-rank mutant himself. The mage looked at Ray in confusion. His father said that there was a hidden entrance in the wall and a large crowd of beasts had appeared from there. Ray gritted his teeth, saying that the twin horns had remained in order to buy some time for the young soldiers to retreat. The monster rushed towards the archer. Adam appeared in front of Helen. The archer widened her eyes when she saw the claws. The monster attacked Adam with its claws. Arthur remembered Adam ruffling his hair as a child. Ray said that Adam had not survived. Arthur looked at his father with panic in his eyes. He said that it was not true and he was sure that there were no more beasts there. Arthur sat with dejected faces. Ray said that he could not know, noting that Helen said that the other entrance was disguised. The parents looked at the floor with sad eyes. Ray said that it was impossible to detect even the slightest fluctuation of mana through the wall. Alice noted that they were not prepared for battle. Alice sat down next to her husband, saying that the twin horns did their best to hold them back, but more people died than anyone could have predicted. Arthur's eyes widened, thinking of Tessa. Arthur looked at his parents with a serious expression, asking who else. Alice said that they did not know, noting that it was an emergency message, and Helen only briefly described the situation and mentioned Adam. Arthur looked at his parents with concern. He said that he really felt sorry for Adam, but that was why he joined the war. The mage looked down with concern. Ray told him not to misunderstand. Ray looked at his son with a serious expression. He said that they were not doing this out of guilt. The soldier's life was only in danger. The mage said that even so. Arthur stood with his back turned, looking at his parents. He said that they had every right to participate in this war, and even for him it would be selfish to try to stop them, asking if they weren't being selfish to put themselves at such grave risk when it wasn't so much useless as reckless. Arthur put his hand to his head. He told them to think about what would happen to Ellie, noting that if one of them died, how it would hurt her and how it would affect him. Alice looked away sadly. She said that it was selfish and they understood all the possible consequences for both of them. Arthur looked at his parents, dumbfounded. Alice told him not to blame his father for this decision, since the one who wanted to return to the twin horns was her. Alice looked at her son with a confident look. The mage asked if she wanted to go to war. Her mother said yes. Alice looked ahead with a serious look. Arthur said that she couldn't, noting that he meant that his father had told him that she had difficulty using her magic because of an event that happened in the past, asking why at that time. The parents looked at each other and nodded. Alice patted the bed, asking her son to sit next to him. Arthur looked at his mother with confusion. Alice told him to let her tell him something. Arthur sat next to his mother. Alice said that he had heard many stories about their adventures in the Twin Horns. Alice smiled slightly, saying that they never told him that there was another person in the squad before he was born. Alice remembered walking next to a happy girl. She said her name was Lenza. Lenza was smiling widely. The mother said that she was the complete opposite of her, bold and straightforward. Alice smiled slightly, looking at Lenza. The mother said that for some reason, they immediately found a common language. Lenza quickly sliced through the monster. The girl furrowed her brows, smirking slightly. Mom said she was quite a famous booster even before she joined the Twin Horns. Adam gritted his teeth, attacking the monster. He looked at Lenza with displeasure. Alice said that everyone was surprised to hear that she wanted to join them. Arthur smiled happily as they walked along the path. Alice said that they couldn't talk about the Twin Horns without mentioning Lenza. Lenza patted Ray on the shoulder. She pointed at Alice with a sardonic grin. Ray grabbed Lenza, covering her mouth. Lenza grinned widely, looking at the embarrassed Ray. Alice said that she skillfully handled both Adam and his father, adding that she even managed to draw a smile on Jasmine's face. Adam and Arthur stood in the rain. Alice said that she had only been with them for 2 years until one incident. Theron was pointing warily at the people. Alice said that they had been careless and had been attacked by a swarm of stingers. Alice was treating Lenza's wounds. Mother said that she had treated the wounds as fast as she could. Adam was sitting by a tree while his leg was being treated. Mother said that for most, like his father, it helped them recover much faster, their wounds on their arms and legs quickly disappearing. Alice was sitting next to Durden. She looked behind her in fear, hearing screams. Lenza was lying on the ground, while a purple aura was glowing inside her. Alice said that the poison from Lenza's wounds had managed to reach the mana core and was starting to spread. Lenza was sitting on the bed with her head down. Alice looked at the girl weirdly. She covered her mouth with her hand when tears appeared in her eyes. Lenza smiled sarcastically through her bangs in her memories. She sat next to her bed then and said that her mana core was completely damaged and she could no longer control mana. Alice cried tearfully, because she believed that if she had done otherwise, she would have died, but as it turned out, if she had not healed the wound then, the doctor could have easily removed the poison, so she robbed her best friend and a member of their team of her only true joy in life. Her friend looked out the window and Alice remembered that she always said that she would be glad to die with honor in battle after what happened. Her empty bed under the dim light from the window, lightning struck the mountain gorge. Lenza stood in the rain. She then walked into the dungeon in the rain. Alice explained that Lenza went into the dungeon alone and never came back. The three of them sat on the bed and her mother said that it was her fault. She clutched her dress tightly, explaining that if it weren't for her treatment, she would be fine. The father and son looked at their wife, who said that not all lives were as exciting as Arthur's life, and for them it was not some sharp and painful blow, and no, it was a slow heartbreaking pain beyond their control. Arthur looked at his mother with concern. She wiped a tear with a smile, noting that they honestly loved her, and since then she was afraid to use her magic for anything more than small scratches. She looked away intently, stating that she knew that Adam's death was not like Lenza's death, but remembering everything that the twin horns did for them then, and she felt that they should be there, next to them. The son looked at his mother with sadness. He listened sadly to his mother, who decided to be honest. It was hard for them to think about him fighting somewhere out there, and they were just sitting at home and just waiting for good news. Arthur immediately asked about Ellie and what if they themselves did not return. The father touched his son. They both looked at Arthur, and Ray added that it didn't matter how strong he was, death rarely came from weakness, and it came when they were not careful. Ray added that the same was true for Arthur, but at least they would contribute to his victory. His father stared ahead and said that he would protect his wife, and stated that Arthur could be sure that they would do everything to return to him safely, and that should include him. Arthur looked weirdly at his father, who suggested that they had not raised him exactly the way they wanted, and because of these memories of his past life and all. His father looked at his son from under his brows and said that one thing was for sure, that Ellie saw him as her favorite brother. So he asked him not to rush to sacrifice himself for some greater good, and even if they lost this war there would always be a way to fight back after. The sun was shining on Arthur when his father declared that he could only lose to the real one, only at the moment of death, when there would definitely be no second chances. They stared at their son, who looked away. He was about to say something when his father and mother immediately said that it was too early to joke about it. The three of them were sitting on the bed, and Varian, whom they called the commander, entered their room. He was immediately taken aback that they were parents and asked them to just call Varian. The parents stood in front of an old man, who said that he heard about the loss in their troops, and he asked them to accept his deepest condolences, and he thought that they should have heard the message they had just received that the rest of the army was approaching right now. Arthur's entire family was alarmed by this news. Arthur's entire family followed Varian. The guard was about to open the doors for them. The old man stared ahead while the others were surprised. They saw a bunch of wounded people near the portal. The old man approached the wounded soldier and thanked him for his service. Arthur saw how the woman mourned her deceased loved one. Suddenly Arthur exclaimed when he heard the name Helen. He saw how his team came out of the portal, to whom the parents ran. Ray and Alice looked at the brunette with concern, asking about what happened to the rest of the guys. The girl sadly lowered her eyes and said that they were fine. The rest of the twin horns were taken to the infirmary. Then she began to say that it was supposedly very hard. Tears began to appear in her eyes. Alice and Ray immediately hugged her to calm her down. The main character sadly looked at the floor, listening to the exclamations of her parents, who advised the girl to go to the infirmary and rest there, and they would go with her. Suddenly, the girl decided to run up to the guy. She immediately hugged the main character tightly. Arthur looked ahead sadly, noting to Helen that he was glad that she was okay, and explained that he was very sorry. Helen looked at the worried boy, explaining that she knew what he was thinking about. She frowned at him and said that war is war and deaths were inevitable. She frowned and said that the best thing for them to do now was to focus and figure out how to make those bastards Alacrians and their pets pay for all of this. Arthur looked at the girl with bewilderment, who asked him not to blame himself. At first, he remained silent, closing his lips, and resigned himself to it. He and Varian watched as Helen was taken away by his parents. Sylvie looked at the sad boy, who understood that his parents were going to tell Helen about their return to the team of twin horns. Ray and Alice hugged the brunette as they took her away. Arthur knew that she would be pleased to hear this, because with Adam gone now the twin horns, she now, more than ever, needed support. People continued to come out of the portal. Arthur stared at the people coming out of the portal. He saw the wounded Stannard holding his side. He immediately crept up to the blonde and touched him. He tightly squeezed the blonde's shoulder and began to ask him about what Tesha was. Stannard slightly grimaced in pain and asked Arthur not to squeeze so hard. The two guys stood in the middle of the wounded people and Arthur apologized to the fighter, expressing happiness that he remained alive. The main character looked at the blonde, asking him about where the rest of the people from his team were. Stannard replied that he did not know because after they broke through to the base, the Twin Horns tried to take all the wounded to a safe place, so he lost sight of everyone. The guys looked back at the portal, which began to sparkle, and they realized that they had arrived here. Kuria was carrying Darvis on her back through the portal. The brunette looked forward in surprise. Arthur immediately came to the rescue and grabbed the guy. Darvis grimaced when the girl thanked Arthur. The brunette looked at how they began to heal Darvis. The healer saw how they carried a kettle. Arthur was carrying a kettle for Kuria. The girl looked at Arthur in amazement, who asked her what happened to Tesha. The girl touched her chin. Then Arthur quickly looked back. He saw more people coming out of the portal. He saw how an exhausted Tesha came out of the portal, and Arthur realized that the princess clearly knew how to choose the right moment. Arthur looked at what was happening with slight bewilderment. His hand in a black cape reached forward. He remembered how he ended up in the royal palace. He then looked ahead in amazement. He stood next to the old man and looked towards the king. He looked at the elf king in amazement, who hoped that Arthur would take his advice seriously, and he would be wise to close his heart to the elf princess. The main character extended his hand towards Tesha. The girl looked ahead in amazement, heard Arthur, and said that she was glad to see him. Arthur immediately hugged her. He sadly closed his eyes, hugging the girl, and said that he was very glad she was whole. The princess looked ahead in amazement. She immediately smiled and hugged him back, agreeing with his words. The main character touched the girl, looking into her eyes. He wanted to take her to her grandfather. The old man immediately hugged his granddaughter. The girls looked at the old man standing next to his granddaughter. He understood that he did not get to spend much time with Arthur during their short reunion. Varian and Tesha looked away worriedly. The old man touched his beard in vain. The princess understood that her grandfather insisted that she go to her room as soon as possible and be examined by doctors there. The main character and the old man looked at the portal, and Tesha thought that if it weren't for her pain at the party, she would be fine. People were wandering around the area past the wounded. Kuria, along with Stannard and Darvish, were fast asleep. Suddenly, they saw a footstep in front of them. Tesha walked up to Stannard, realizing that she felt calmer when she saw that her team was taken care of. The blonde man looked at Tesha's hand with a slight smirk. They gave each other a fist bump because she was glad that her friends were safe. The princess immediately plopped down on her bed. She looked up with a smile and felt this short moment, because it was nice to be back in her room. Then she looked to the side at the light. She saw a picture of her and her grandmother on the nightstand. She turned on her side and thought that at least all this remained unchanged. The blue moon illuminated the night city. Tesha sadly held her head, realizing that she was very tired, but still could not fall asleep. She sat down on the edge of the bed and hoped that her grandfather was not asleep yet. She began to walk along the corridor. Suddenly, she exclaimed when she heard her grandfather talking. She approached the half-open door and heard the conversation that Arthur was telling Varian that he could not hide something like this from his granddaughter because it would be impossible, because she would find out about it anyway. The princess heard the conversation with surprise, realizing that it was Arthur's speech. Behind the door, the main character was talking to Varian. The old man replied that it would not change anything if Tesha found out about it later, but it was better not to burden her with it now because he understood that now she was not in a state to accept it. The princess looked ahead through the crack and tried to understand what they were talking about. She touched the door and peered through the crack and heard her grandfather say that if Arthur showed that he respected her, then she would definitely listen to him, and even more so if she learned about it from someone else. He asked to suggest further reasoning. The girl immediately decided to knock on the door. Varian turned to the guy with indignation, explaining what would happen if she decided to go now, and in that case everything would be different. Tesha peered through the crack of the door when Arthur explained that they both knew what his granddaughter was capable of and if some idea got stuck in her head. Tesha looked ahead in shock, hearing that the guy just knew what would happen next because after the death of Cynthia, who died due to the fault of the villains from the Virtua group right here in the castle, Tesha remembered the pleasant moments with her grandmother. She remembered the quivering smile of the magician's grandmother and was shocked that she was dead, not believing it. The princess with a downcast look reasoned about what was happening. Suddenly she opened the door. Arthur was about to leave, looking back at the old man, and said that he would be in his room and asked to let him know when Varian decided to tell her. They suddenly saw the princess in front of them. Tesha stood with a downcast look in front of them. She lowered her head and asked to take her to Master Cynthia. The night cover with the moon enveloped the castle. The guys went down the stairs after the old man. Tesha walked by with a sad look and wondered why Cynthia was buried in such a dirty and humiliating place. After all, these were the dungeons for murderers and traitors. Varian looked back at his granddaughter and noted that this was the most secure place they could keep her, and when circumstances allowed, they would hold a proper farewell ceremony for her. Suddenly, Arthur stopped. They were standing near the dungeon, and the old man asked the guard to open the doors for them. Arthur behind Varian began to look around. They saw a white coffin in front of them. The girl immediately fell in front of the coffin. She looked at what was happening with a dejected look, hearing that only a few people knew about the death of the mage's grandmother. Arthur and the old man looked ahead sadly. The princess declared that for all her services to their continent, the mage was worthy of a public ceremony, which would be attended by all the students of Zyres who studied under her. Tesha began to cry tearfully, baring her teeth. She lowered her head in sorrow, saying that she did not deserve to lie in this place. Varian was about to come up behind her granddaughter and tried to calm her down. The princess turned around angrily, screaming at her grandfather about how he could have hidden this information from her, because if she had not accidentally overheard their conversation, then when would he have decided to tell her about it at all? The old man looked at his granddaughter in bewilderment, who began to speak. Was he really going to tell her weeks, months, or immediately after the war, and tried to understand what else he was hiding from her? The girl looked tearfully at Varian and said that despite how much effort she put into proving to him that she was already an adult and that she had already grown up, he still treated her like a child. She angrily screamed at her grandfather. She glared at him through tears when Arthur replied that she was still a child. She looked ahead with slight worry, not expecting to hear that. Tessa immediately looked at Arthur, not understanding how he could say that, since he knew better than anyone how she felt, but he still called her a child. Arthur looked away in shame when Tessa asked why he of all people said that to her. She glared at him when he told her that she would not grow up even if she was on the front lines from an early age, needlessly putting herself in danger, just because she wanted to prove a point. Varian immediately raised his hand, standing next to Tessa, when Arthur added that in this way she was not much different from a child who had fallen into hysterics. Arthur tilted his head forward, telling her that if she thought about it for even a minute, she would understand why her grandfather had to keep it a secret. She waved her hand angrily, stating how she could think what would happen if an old man announced that someone had been killed right here in the safest place on the continent. The girl bared her teeth in anger. Arthur looked at the angry girl, telling her that she was only 17, but she exclaimed that he himself was only 16. She glared at Arthur, who looked down and added that with all that Varian, Master Alder, and even Master Sylvie had never treated him like a child. Arthur replied that if they saw him as an adult, it meant that they had come to that conclusion on their own, and he had not tried to convince them of it. The old man immediately drew Arthur's attention, stating that Arthur had already said enough, but Arthur thought otherwise and wanted to prove his point. They both looked at the girl, who exclaimed that it was unfair. She bared her teeth angrily and said from under her brows that he had the opportunity to do whatever he wanted, but it didn't matter how hard she tried, because they would continue to see her as a girl who needed protection. Arthur immediately began to shout at her that this was not so. The girl bared her teeth through tears and said that he should not expect her to act like his sister. He could not lock up everyone he cared about. Arthur opened his mouth in surprise. The old man immediately intervened in the dialogue between them, telling them to stop. Varian glanced at the guy, who noted that he was most likely mistaken. Arthur stared intently through his bangs, stating that the girl was most likely not ready to find out about this. The guy decided to distance himself from the Tesha family. The old man immediately began to calm his crying granddaughter. The old man hugged his granddaughter, looking back at the coffin, and said that for now they should show Sylvie their respect. There was a bouquet of flowers on the tombstone, and the Elf King replied that instead of gathering crowds of people for the ceremony, the mage grandmother would prefer a meeting of close friends who truly cherished her. The princess tearfully covered her face with her hand. She touched the floor with her fingers as she sat down. The old man sat down with his granddaughter in front of the coffin. At this time, the night moon illuminated the castle. Arthur walked forward with a thoughtful look. Following Arthur, his mana-beast Sylvie ran. She furiously grabbed his leg. Arthur began to angrily shake his leg to throw Sylvie, who had hurt him. The guy immediately grabbed his beast by the scruff of the neck. He furiously began to shout at Sylvie, asking her about what it was. Arthur then made a face of displeasure, trying to ask the beast what the scene was and what she meant by this action. He held the scruff of the neck of the caustic beast, who answered him about his thoughts, which were louder than he thought. He immediately threw the beast off, informing him that he had just said what Tesha needed to hear. They began to walk forward, and Arthur stated that Tesha had let her emotions take over her logic and did not even think about what was objectively best for the continent, and that she should not have done this neither as a princess nor as a soldier. Sylvie looked at her master in bewilderment, who noted that it was necessary. The furry beast followed her master with a smile and replied that Tesha should not have said what she said about Ellie. Arthur walked without looking back when Sylvie wondered if the guy was the first one to snap at her because of her parents going to war, to which she received a negative answer. Arthur sadly suggested that it was still possible. The guy put his hands in his pockets and looked back at Sylvie, trying to find out the truth from her and what she really learned in Ephias. The animal lazily wagged its tail and answered that she was getting stronger and also took a small course on how to properly growl at him. Sylvie glanced at her owner with one eye. They looked at the night sky, and Arthur said that she missed simpler times. There was clear weather over the city. An old woman looked ahead with the stain, squinting. A small boy named Gray looked at her fearfully. The blonde sat across from the old lady and she stated that she was probably not the best person and she would not be able to help him with his kindness. Although his energy reserves were lower than other kids his age and he would still have plenty of time to change them. Gray stared at the woman, folding his arms, when she added that it would be a life lesson for him. If he realized that he lacked some resources, then he should make sure to save them until they were really needed. Director Wilbeck frowned, closing her eyes when Gray thanked her and said that he probably understood what she meant. She remembered seeing the full backpacks on the porch. She began to laugh sarcastically, trying to get back to what was needed most. Then she learned that they recently received quite a large donation, literally out of nowhere. Gray sheepishly scratched his cheek, trying to understand how it happened. The blonde boy gasped in shock when Wilbeck announced that they would no longer accept donations. Arthur jumped up in alarm, trying to figure out what was going on. The director put her hand on her head when Arthur thought that they were going to try to close the shelter. The woman replied that it was not like that and that the government had simply become interested in them and would be sponsoring them from now on. Gray's eyes widened in surprise when Wilbeck announced that they would no longer have to worry about money and asked Arthur if he understood that now. Arthur stared ahead, wondering if they had crossed the line, since they usually failed, but then again, they were talking about witches. Gray remembered himself next to his brunette friend. Gray bowed his head to the principal, breathing a sigh of relief that she had told him that. Arthur was about to leave, but Wilbeck called out to him, telling him before he left. She asked him about how he got along with Nico and Cecilia. The blonde looked away with a worried look. The older woman stared ahead, crossing her fingers when Arthur replied that with the exception of her little antics, they were slowly breaking through her armor. The blonde looked sheepishly, holding his head when the woman asked him about the girl not saying a word to him, to which Arthur replied that not one. Wilbeck began to yawn, stating that she sincerely hoped that he would continue to try to get her out of her shell, and if anyone was going to be able to do it, it would definitely be the two of them. Gray looked at the brunette in amazement, asking her why she was trying so hard to make him and Cecilia friends. The woman smiled wickedly in response. She immediately decided to stand up, reminding him that this was the story she hoped Cecilia would tell him herself. The guy began to add that he meant that she looked pretty normal, but everyone was afraid of her because of these little antics. He remembered how the girl sat to the side at the desk. Gray scratched his cheek, explaining that it wasn't that he or Nico was scared by this, but still. Wilbeck put her hand on the table near the guy, who stated that several children ended up in the infirmary because of her, and it seemed to him that it would be better to know more about her so that they could help her. The director immediately patted the guy on the head. She looked at him with a smile and said that it would not matter how much he learned about Cecilia, because she would always remain the one who knew herself best. The director looked ahead with trepidation and thought that if the girl did not know something, she would figure it out on her own, because Gray's job was not to help, but to be her friend. She kept her hand on his head and added that when Cecilia needed his help, she would ask him about it herself. The guy enthusiastically raised his hand to his head and accepted the order, and he would remember this. The woman looked at him with a smile and said that she was Director Wilbeck for him now. Arthur walked down the corridor with a thoughtful look when the guys called out to him. The joyful children tried to persuade him to play with them. The guy winked at his friends, sighing with relief. The brunette began to playfully push the blonde. The blonde deftly ran around all the guys, who began to fall because they could not catch him. The brunette was about to jump on the blonde, who asked them to try harder. Gray immediately grabbed Arthur, who sighed. Gray looked at the children sitting with a smile and said that it was a good try, but Lord Alder prepared a game especially for this moment. The blonde sighed mockingly, looking at the disgruntled children. The blonde began to pat the children on the head, who noted that he was too fast. Gray replied that only weaklings, when losing, looked for excuses. The guy began to squeeze the disgruntled children, asking the children to move on, because his strength was needed elsewhere. The guy waved goodbye to the children when they said that they would definitely catch him next time. Gray noticed that a board had come out of the floor. He came closer to the board coming out, realizing that lately everything at home was breaking faster than usual. He assumed that Principal Wilbeck was currently busy with more important things. He crouched down and touched the board, thinking that he should help her do another inspection of the house. The blonde then kicked down the door and saw Nico embroidering, stating that the almighty Gray had arrived, and he was told to close the door immediately. The blonde looked at Nico's knitting in confusion, not understanding when he had learned to do this. Gray then decided to reach for the glove, trying to find out what it was. Nico immediately grabbed Gray's hand. The blonde immediately became excited, experiencing an electric shock. Gray held his hand in shock, not understanding what that was just now. The brunette looked at the glove with a smile, stating that one should never underestimate the power of knitting. Arthur proudly looked at his glove, noting that it was elegant, because after their encounter with those thugs, he decided to find a way to protect himself. Gray looked at the glove with displeasure when Arthur explained that he had jotted down some notes on materials that could pass Chi, and the glove was made of microfiber that could conduct Chi to a certain extent. His glove squeezed his hand and conducted electricity. Nico explained that it had a small stone sewn into it that used his energy, and when he grabbed someone, the microfibers would lengthen and penetrate the enemy's muscles. Nico then decided to take off the glove when Gray was surprised that such a brainy guy had not yet been adopted, although the guy himself was in no hurry. The blonde looked at his friend with trepidation, who noted that the most important thing in life is family. He realized that he had no memories of his parents, neither good nor bad, but Nico hated his parents and sometimes he thought that he was even luckier to be left without memories. The brunette sadly connected the wires on the glove. Gray watched as his friend shook his head. The blonde noted that the glove was very intricate, but wondered why Nico didn't just learn to fight like him. Nico replied that he had never learned to fight. The brunette stared at the glove and stated that he needed toys like that, because unlike some people, he didn't have the reflexes of a primitive predator. The blonde smirked and pictured a sloth and a turtle when Nico stated that if he were asked to rate himself, he would say that he was somewhere between the two animals. The blonde noted that while the glove seemed effective, they only helped him buy himself some time. Nico waved his hand dismissively, saying that the microfibers were still expensive and in his opinion, they wore out too quickly. Arthur then turned their attention to the pile of things when Nico explained that he spent some of the money from the pawn jewelry on materials. The blonde looked at the smiling Nico with a sneer, asking him how he transferred all the remaining money to the director. The brunette answered that he just got help from a guy he knew. Gray grimaced in horror when Nico explained that his friend presented a generous donation to the director of Wilbeck in exchange for a certain percentage. Arthur looked at the smiling Nico and took into account his filled shopping and the percentage and asked how much the shelter ended up getting. Nico mockingly rubbed his face, saying that he had no choice and Olivia would never take their money without any questions. The blonde pinched the brunette's breast, noting that she was the director of Wilbeck. Nico convulsively held his body when he heard that they were lucky that they no longer had to worry about money, and now the main expenses of the shelter would be covered by the state. The brunette asked enthusiastically so he could spend all that dirty money on microfibers. Gray grimaced with disdain and the brunette said he was joking. He immediately handed the book to Gray and said that he had actually bought him a couple of books with the change. The blonde looked at the book in surprise, ironically answering that it was very good, and now the magnanimous gentleman forgives him for such an unsuccessful joke. Suddenly the brunette's eyes widened. They looked around in fear, realizing that most likely they heard Cecilia and this time she knocked longer than usual. Gray looked dumbfoundedly towards his friend, who offered to check her. Arthur looked at the brunette and said that it was too dangerous and he forgot what happened to the volunteer who tried to calm her down. Nico noted that he could not even get close to her and also asked to take into account that he was like a bear. Nico looked down sadly and said that he simply couldn't stand sitting and waiting for the girl to faint and he couldn't even imagine how it could hurt her. The blonde whispered to his friend that he most likely liked Cecilia and Nico immediately grimaced. The brunette angrily pointed his finger at his friend, shouting that this had never happened and that he didn't even know her. Gray waved his hand towards the angry Nico, who said that he only thought she was pretty. The guys began to walk quietly down the hallway. They walked down the hallway excitedly. Then Gray's eyes widened. They saw a couple in front of the door, realizing that it was Randall. Nico looked warily at what was happening and didn't understand why the guys were just standing there and not trying to help anyone. Gray immediately snatched his friend's glove and wanted to check something. The guy immediately rushed forward. The blonde looked ahead with anger, realizing that Randall would not be able to reach her safely through such a dense aura. People looked on in shock as the blonde burst through the door and tried to stop him. The guy saw Cecilia, who was surrounded by a blue aura. He grimaced from the flow of aura, realizing that Cecilia was an exception among users, while the most skilled practitioner could only create some weak gust of wind. He tried to get through the aura energies to the girl, realizing that she was able to surround herself with streams of Kai. But she could not control them. The girl held her head, radiating energy from herself. As the headmistress explained, her energy burst out at the slightest emotional provocation, although most users of such energy would think that it was a gift from God. Gray held his head, realizing that for a child like her, this was more like a curse. The girl held her head in horror. The blonde decided to get through the streams to the girl, but got a cut on himself, and Cecilia warned him to stay away from her. He practically ran to her bed when she screamed that he would most likely get hurt. He held out his gloved hand to her, trying to help her. Cecilia extended her hand in response. They grabbed each other's hands and an electric shock occurred. The brown-haired woman threw her head back. Then she fell onto the bed unconscious. Gray looked at his hands and realized that he was sorry. He looked at the glove and realized that even such a small thing completely drained his Kai. The guys ran into their room. Bright lights heaped through the window. Arthur was sleeping with Sylvie at this time as they tried to wake him up. The assistant knocked on the door as the commander approached her. The maid tried to wake Arthur, saying that he needed to bathe and prepare him for the performance of Commander Varian. The man in the suit pushed her away, raising his hand. He wanted to wake Arthur himself and blew up the door. Arthur immediately jumped up. He decided to get out of bed, saying that he was not happy to see him. Baron emitted lightning from his hand and noted that Arthur learned a couple of new tricks. Arthur asked if he didn't know that it was dishonorable to attack someone from behind. The blonde replied that they were at war after all. Baron looked back at Arthur, asking him to change his clothes, and the rest of the spears were already waiting for him near the teleportation gate. Arthur sighed with a grin, realizing that after what happened with Lucas, his relationship with Baron had deteriorated. He saw the blonde man leave the room, expressing understanding for the blonde's words about the war. The blonde's white cape fluttered after his departure. Arthur understood that they were irreplaceable with him and all their differences did not matter when the fate of their continent was at stake. The maid looked at the guy in fear, when the other maids tried to calm her down. The maids bowed to Arthur in greeting and said that they had just received consent from Commander Varian to speed up this process. The large maid bowed to Arthur, explaining that if he was not in the mood to take a bath himself, she would be happy to help him. Arthur mockingly replied that he was certainly in the mood to wash himself. The other maids wheeled a cart into the room, telling him that after his bath he should put on this suit of armor. Arthur looked at the card in surprise when it was explained to him that Lord Alder had prepared a suit especially for this moment. The hallway was illuminated by lamps. It was clear weather above the front garden. The sun shone on the building and the fountain. Priscilla adjusted Blaine's collar, trying to reassure her husband so that he would not worry too much. The brunette looked in awe at her king, who replied that he was simply trying to understand why Commander Varian had decided to give a speech in Eddystone when those Alacron terrorists were almost to their shores. Priscilla looked back at the old man, saying that she was worried about that too. Varian turned to the bald aide as Priscilla stated that this was the reason they were leaving their castle after all. The king and queen looked back at the elves, who agreed that this was indeed a surprising decision. Alder stood at the front in leadership and noted that he believed it was necessary to inspire the crowd gathered there, as Commander Varian hoped that seeing their forces up close would make them believe in their victory more than seeing the enemy ships in the distance. They immediately looked back at the two armored elves, stating that with all the copies gathered behind them looking down on them, they were sure that the commander would get the reputation he craved. Blaine lowered his head, closing his eyes, and hoped that was true, as the real start of this war could shake everyone up greatly. Suddenly, they looked back. Varian also looked away, noticing that someone had decided to show themselves in front of them. They saw a guy in armor who addressed an old man. Arthur in armor put his hand to his chest and addressed everyone in the hall by name. He looked forward intently, saying that they had not seen each other for a long time. He came closer to the royal family. When Muriel noted that he had grown up, however, he replied that he had matured a little. Blaine looked at Arthur with a smile, noting that he still had time to grow, and not only up but also to become stronger, which was required of one of his best soldiers. The king was perplexed to hear the phrase from Arthur, when he said that despite his roots and race, in a war of such a scale, he considered the king as a soldier of an entire continent. Arthur closed his eyes in front of the king. Suddenly, they looked back at the bald old man, who was glad to meet Arthur in such a way. The old man extended his hand with a smile and introduced himself as the new delegate from the dwarves, Radius. They shook hands and the old man stated that he had learned quite a bit about him from the letters from Elijah. Radius, with one eye half open, noted that it was him. Arthur looked down with slight sadness when he heard that this delegate had been Elijah's guardian since he was a baby. Arthur lowered his head, stating that he had not been there when Arthur needed help and he was very sorry. The old man grabbed Arthur's hand. He looked at the fighter with awe and said that it was not his fault because the child had always been a magnet for trouble. They held hands good-naturedly when Arthur stated that he and Elijah were best friends. He remembered how they used to smile together. He remembered how they used to fall asleep together and how he used to scare him from behind. Arthur held the old man's hands and stated that he would definitely bring him back and gave his word. The delegate nodded his head in gratitude. Varian at the portal shouted for the spears to be ready. Arthur and the old man looked at the commander, who stated that when the time came, the gatekeeper would give them a signal. Radius blocked his view with his back, when Sylvie noted that if it were possible, she would like to spend more time with Radius. The white beast looked at his master and noted that it would be nice to know what Elijah was like as a young man. The brunette from behind Arthur looked at him while he thought about how Elijah ended up in Dari and was raised by someone so high-ranking. The girl walked from behind him. She extended her hand to him with a smile, greeting him and saying that they had met before. Arthur was surprised to remember the image of the girl when she stated that she did not have the pleasure of introducing herself last time. They touched hands. As they shook hands, they looked at each other in surprise. The girl smiled, saying that it was nice to finally meet him and introduced herself as I.A. Griffin and was sure that they would get along. She then walked forward. Sylvie looked at the girl with a smile, finding her cute. I walked forward, glowing with a dark aura, and the beast noticed it. Suddenly, the main character looked back when he was complimented on how much he had grown during his training. Lord Andrath looked ahead arrogantly and noted that Arthur had already managed to go beyond the initial silver stage and had already moved on to the middle one. They looked at each other, and the main character replied that he still had a long way to go if he wanted to reach the white stage. Suddenly, Arthur's eyes widened when he was told that the path was not as long as he thought. Immediately, an order was heard for the fighters to go into the portal. Arthur looked back at his lively beast, who found this incident funny. They began to walk one after another into the portal, and he realized that he had a very strange definition for happiness. Arthur covered his face with his hands. The crowd of people cheered over the screen of their queens. Blaine, along with other high-ranking officials, greeted the inhabitants. Princess Caitlin and Prince Curtis also greeted everyone. Varian together with Miriel were also in character. The crowd rejoiced, looking at the screens of the elf kings. Arthur stood behind all the high nobility and realized that he had not been in front of such a huge crowd for a long time. The maid approached the main character and asked the generals to prepare for Varian's signal. The old man immediately decided to clear his throat before the speech. All the people listened attentively to the commander's speech when he said that many of them had already managed to overcome a long way to get here, and he was filled with pride for them. Varian stood on the balcony in front of the crowd and announced that their leaders were standing behind him, and these were the very people who had protected this continent for decades and the ones who would protect them in the future. The old man placed his hand on his chest and shouted that kings and queens were not the ones who would constantly risk their lives on the front lines. He pointed to Baron standing behind him and stated that he wanted them all to help him greet the fierce generals. Aya along with the other blonde elves clasped their hands when they were introduced. The old man raised his hand above the crowd. The villagers looked up in surprise when they were told that they were now living together in a time of war, and as they had already noticed, half of the spears were already missing, and this was not by mistake, and while they were talking, the rest were fighting on the battlefield. Baron stared ahead with the lord as Varian spoke of how they had once promised that the title of spear was not given by birth or status, but by talent, strength, and much hard work. Arthur walked behind the old man and Varian said that today, with the entry of a new hero into their ranks, a new era was dawning. Arthur walked toward the balcony from afar as Varian introduced him to their newest champion, Arthur. He approached the balcony and the crowd began to cheer. Prince Curtis watched the events with trepidation. Tessa, accompanied by her parents, also clapped her hands. Arthur looked at the old man sarcastically, realizing that it was his idea. Arthur, with a wide smile, told the old man that if someone else had been behind this, and not him, then he would have definitely gotten angry. Varian looked at the guy good-naturedly and asked him to continue smiling and waving, and then people would be able to see him on the widescreen projection behind them. Arthur continued to wave his hand timidly when the Elf King asked him if he had accidentally prepared a speech about the upcoming war, and this immediately embarrassed the guy. He looked at Varian with sweat on his brow and said that he was not even prepared for the fact that he would be officially introduced as one of the copies, let alone a certain stage speech. The old man replied that he did not want the fighter to prepare anything. The Elven King pointed his finger at the crowd, telling Arthur that these were his people. They looked at each other, and the old man said that Arthur had grown up among these people. Arthur looked sadly at the amulet in his hands when Varian noted that people would listen to his words with much more willingness and sympathy than to the words of some well-fed nobleman. Arthur examined the golden brooch in his hands when they confided in him. The old man smiled next to the confused Arthur and asked him to remain true to himself and speak to them. The people cheered enthusiastically. His parents also waited for their son to speak. Arthur looked at the cheering crowd, hearing that they were all his people. A proud eagle soared above the cheering crowd. Arthur held the amulet in front of him. He leaned his hand against the balcony and addressed the people of Dicathan, thanking them once again for being here today. Despite his age, he had read many books on the history and economy of their continent. He looked at the flags of the people waiting and added that none of the books had said where the citizens' loyalty to their country came from, with some suggesting that citizens had a natural attraction to their country. Shaitan looked ahead and explained that one author had claimed that there was a trickle-down effect. His family had listened intently as their son explained that this trickle-down effect began with leaders ensuring the safety and well-being of their people, and ended with parents feeding their children, and as long as this flow of safety was maintained, then he claimed a natural loyalty to one's country. Arthur placed his hand on his chest and stated that he had told them all this because he did not agree with that statement and he wanted to believe that loyalty was not just a calculated decision of the citizens. The people all listened intently as he explained that it was not the dictates of rulers or the judgment of place of birth, but that the loyalty of the citizens was born from free choice. The leaders of the continent looked at Arthur in awe as he explained that it had to be from choice, fueled by the support of family, friends, and fellow citizens, and the promise to protect each other and grow together. Kesha looked down sadly. Arthur spoke on the projection screen and added that perhaps it was arrogant to try to define the word, when everyone had their own thoughts on the matter and expressed loyalty to the country in their own way. The king along with Priscilla listened to Arthur, who said that one thing was for sure, loyalty was always more primitive, when times were simpler, and it was easier to welcome a king when their child was fed and their land prospered. The elves and humans looked up, and he said that in times of war it was easier to unite when victory was already certain. Ray looked down sadly as his sons stated that war would not be easier and their loyalty to the country and the entire continent would be tested. Sylvie looked at her master, who stated that the humans had a choice to die with their people or to hope to survive with the enemies. Arthur frowned and reported that he, standing here and speaking of his choice, despite his rank as a spear, his loyalty was not bought, but it was not given thoughtlessly either. Arthur looked forward and remembered how he was little, playing with his dad. The fighter added that his loyalty to this continent and all the creatures on it was nurtured in his childhood in the village. He remembered how he laughed so hard with Elijah. He remembered how he laughed with the group from the disciplinary committee when he was an adventurer. He remembered walking across the square next to the beast when he was a student and teacher. Arthur immediately frowned and shouted that now his loyalty would be proven by his rank as a spearman. All the nobles stood behind him as Arthur said that Dickathan and his leaders had their faults. Virion glared forward as the fighter said that no one could say that they didn't try, and the union of the three kingdoms was unthinkable just a few generations ago. The elf family along with the delegate listened attentively. How yet, the leaders of the three races had put aside their pride and differences to unite to share resources to improve the lives of everyone living here. He added that although discrimination would still exist, the land they lived on belonged to them all. However, just outside the city an enemy army was waiting for them with over 100 ships approaching their shores. The people stared at the screen with Arthur. The other elf generals looked ahead sadly as Arthur spoke of how they were given a choice, to make all members of the ruling family or continue this war on a much more destructive scale. The old man stood next to Arthur as he stated that the commander was willing to sacrifice his life to protect the continent, but he had hoped for something different. Arthur stood in front of everyone with the old man, and he stated that he would rather fight and die honorably for the country he loved than to bet on a promise from his enemies that they might not keep. The two boys looked ahead wordly as their leader stated that he did not dare to speak for everyone on this continent, and the only thing he could say with complete certainty was that everyone who stood before them now was willing to fight to their last breath to protect Dickathan from those who dared to invade them. All the leaders came up behind Arthur as he spoke. His family listened to their son's speech with emotions overwhelmed. One of the elves clenched his fists and became angry. All the people began to cheer loudly, shouting that their city needed a long life. Sylvie began to emit purple light under the cheers of the crowd. Arthur looked to the side, noticing this light. He saw a black wing flapping. Sylvie's fierce gaze glowed yellow. The black dragon immediately growled. Arthur looked closely at his dragon. Then he looked at his pet with a smile under the cheers of the crowd. Varian looked with the guy at the cheering crowd. Then the main character began to leave. He tremblingly squeezed his pet, who asked him if she did the right thing. Arthur praised Sylvie, saying that she thus conveyed the essence to everyone with her demonstration. Curtis and the princess called out to Arthur. The red-haired prince maliciously put his hands on his hips and said that the last part of the speech was simply incredible. The three of them stood opposite each other. The prince noted that he had heard that Sylvie had become a dragon when the school was attacked, but he was glad to see him again anyway. Princess Caitlin looked at Arthur and asked him if he would attend the official reception in the city and was refused. He stood with his back to the portal and replied that he had to visit another place. The fading sunset enveloped the castle courtyard. His family was holding a burial ceremony for Adam. Ray said that he would never forget how Adam helped him save his family from bandits when Ellie was not yet born. Ray held a flower, looking at the tombstone, and stated that it had been a long time since he fought side by side with him, and he remembered the times when he thought that he had not changed at all. Arthur, along with the other boys, mourned with their heads down as Ray said that he was still the same abrupt, impulsive jerk and at the same time sincere, ambitious and selflessly loyal, but he was wrong. His mother, along with the other women, mourned and cried. The father of the family said that when he saw an old friend after so many years, he could not help but feel nostalgic and tried to remember what good times were. Ray sadly held a flower and stated that it was a bad decision to cling to the past, and he could not understand how much Adam had changed, how he had grown as a fighter, a person, a protector, a friend. The father of the family looked ahead sadly and said that he knew Adam would not give up his ambitions even if he was not with them now. He immediately sat down over the grave and added that Adam could never sit quietly, Adam would carry strength and passion even beyond their world. He left a flower on the slab and knew that Adam would want the same for them. He wished him a peaceful sleep and said goodbye to his old friend, saying that they would meet again. The whole family began to cry and hug each other. Arthur looked ahead sadly. The rest of the family approached Arthur and thanked him for coming. Durden looked at Arthur with a slight smile and congratulated him on receiving the rank of spear, and he was sorry that he could not attend his speech. Angela hugged Arthur, saying that they were proud of him. Arthur sadly hugged the blonde. They stood near the grave with other people. Arthur walked towards the old man, telling him that he shouldn't have missed the official reception in the city of Ediston to come here. Brown-haired looked at the commander, saying that permission to hold the funeral here was more than enough. The old man replied that he decided to come here himself. The commander added with a smile that besides, all the queens and kings of the continent were here and they wouldn't download it. Brown-haired looked at the old man, saying that he was sure that Adam would be happy about that. The old man explained that he regretted not taking him here after the speech, and he knew that they had little time, but there was still something he should have thought about as soon as possible. The old man held out a coin in his hand and said that Alduin gave it to him after Aaliyah's death. Brown-haired, with a downcast look, asked if this was Aaliyah's artifact that all the copies had. The commander noted with a smile that it was, and by sprinkling this artifact with their blood, they could activate it. Arthur's glowing silhouette appeared behind him as the old man stated that he was giving him a boost that advanced all the other copies to the white stage. Arthur listened dumbfounded as the old man knew that he was not an elf, but it would still be an honor for him to serve as a spear under him. The fighter lowered his head sadly and reminded the old man that he would have fought for him even without this connection, and he might regret it later, but he would not accept it. He timidly scratched the back of his head and said that he did not need help to break through to the white stage. He smiled and stated that he would do everything himself. Alder intervened in their dialogue and decided to interrupt them, but expressed his agreement with his choice. Arthur watched as the old man gave the artifact to Alder. The guy was surprised, as if Alder had been in the shadows all this time, and he replied that it was his job. Alder took the coin in his hands and stated that the artifact could give him an incredible boost, but it also greatly reduced his further growth opportunities, and he would recommend everyone to use it, especially in these dangerous times. Arthur clenched his fists, glowing with purple light. Alder noted that Arthur was a completely different case, and in addition to his incredible talent, Sylvie's dragon blood flowed through his veins. Alder looked at the saddened guy and added that his powerful will of her mother was hidden in his mana core, and this could be an inconvenience now but an advantage in the future if he survived. Arthur, looking at the artifact, hoped that this future would come soon. The old man looked at Arthur. The rustle of the wind enveloped the beard of the old man, who turned to Arthur, asking him if he was ready for war. The leaves flew past Arthur under the sunset, when he answered with a refusal. He immediately opened his mouth. Tesha was comforting his mother at the time. Arthur looked at the women from afar and replied that it was not his plan to lose to this gate. Arthur and his family stood in front of the portal. Ellie was crying. Arthur turned away. His family looked at him. He thought that they really saw death when it took someone they loved. Ray frowned. Arthur looked at his mother. Alice took his hands and smiled. She turned away, and the parents entered the portal. Arthur's heart sank. He realized that every death should serve as a reminder for everyone to protect those they love. After a while, Arthur leaned on his arm. Sylvie came up to him and said that it was not the best decision to argue before parting. Arthur looked at her and said that every time it seemed that he takes a step forward, it ends up with 2 steps back. He does not understand why they did not listen to his advice. He did not say anything wrong. The redhead frowned when the dragon said that he had technically told them to find a remote place and hide. He replied that he hadn't said that. He let out a breath when she said that he had implied it. He bowed his head and said that he cared more about the safety of his family than this war. He was thankful that they weren't at least dragging his sister into this. Sylvie jumped into his lap when he said that it didn't mean they had to go into battle and risk their lives. The dragon raised an eyebrow when he said that he hoped they understood what he was going through as their son. Arthur looked away when she said that it would be hard for them to notice the truth, but they were trying their best. Arthur closed his eyes and asked, and exactly she had realized who he was. His pupils were narrow when she said that she had always known the truth, she had just been too young to realize it. After all, she had been hearing his thoughts since he was born. Arthur frowned and asked if she could hear every thought, since she only responded when he asked her directly. She replied that for her, talking to his mind was like talking to him in person. She began to wag her tail and said that she had learned to hide some thoughts, but she couldn't say the same about him. The redhead asked if she knew. Sylvie asked if he meant his constant emotional instability about Tessie. Arthur tilted his head and said that he was still not used to many things. The dragon looked at him and said that they would soon go into battle. She looked down and said that her grandfather told her during training that although she was far from reaching the level of a true Azura, his blood flowed through her. Arthur looked at her when she said that although she could fight alongside him, she was not immortal. The best way to survive was to rely on each other. Sylvie raised her eyebrows and said that she was saying this because she had been hiding something from him and had just found out about it herself. He was the only one she could trust with her life. Arthur patted her head and said of course. He looked at her and said that he had raised her since she was born and she should know that she could trust him with anything. He smiled when she thanked him. Arthur continued to scratch the top of Sylvie's head and thought that this was the first time in her entire life that she was scared. The war really bothered her a lot. He looked at her and asked when she became so smart, since Ephiatus she had matured a lot, not even mentioning her rapidly growing ego. The girl said that she had always been good at studying. Why did he think she was always on his head? She hugged him and said that it was for better access to his thoughts. Arthur looked up and thought that she had a right to worry if what Winsome said was true. He thought that along with the enemy ships, Argona's experiments would also be invading them, mages with a surfeit of blood in their veins. His eyes widened as he heard his name being called. Someone had entered the room. He frowned and asked if he was doing this again. Was this really going to happen all the time now? Was it going to be like that now, leaking into the door no longer in fashion or even just opening it? Arthur looked at him and said that he needed something from him. He turned and said that Lord Anrath had told him to rely on his judgment during the war, and after his speech earlier, he understood why. Without turning around, he said that his contribution should not be limited to just a sword. The man frowned and said that when he was no longer needed on the battlefield, he would be at his side in the council. The man replied that he wanted to make it clear. Arthur asked if he really wanted a 16-year-old to make the most important decisions on the council. He replied that although he was the lowest, he was not an ordinary teenager and the time would come when his presence on the council would be necessary. Arthur frowned when Alder said that he would not waste his abilities arguing with the council. He had other plans. Arthur looked at him and asked what about him. It must be frustrating not being able to help despite the great contribution he could make to the victory. He replied that his time would come. Without turning around, he said that this battle would be the dawn of a new era if the Decathlon won and would fight alongside them against the Osiris. Arthur frowned when he said that Argona and his clan of traitors and mongrels would finally fall and they would all gain access to a new continent. Arthur asked if he understood correctly that Argona took someone from him. He turned around and said that they took someone from many. Arthur said that he had no intention of losing this war, but if they wanted his help in doing so. He frowned and said that they should trust his advice. He looked at the old man and said that they, the lesser ones, were fighting their battles. He said that the least they could do was show respect. Arthur frowned when his mentor said that was asking too much. Alder walked behind him and said that was it. He walked forward and said that he was heading to the conference room. He was worried every time he left these lesser people alone for too long. Arthur smiled. He turned and asked him to wait. Arthur said that before he could take up his duties as a spear, he had something he had to do. He smiled when Alder asked what it was. After a while, the knights were fighting. Everyone around them watched. A man and an elf crossed swords. It was in a military camp. A hero walked by in a hood. He looked to the side. A woman stood behind him, asking him to clean out the kebab pots. She waved the ladle and said to check on the stew. The woman turned around. The brunette was looking at Arthur carefully. She said that he looked familiar. The guy laughed. He looked at Sylvie and said that he didn't think anyone would recognize him from far away. People around were screaming. Knights were fighting. The girl blocked a blow. The guy smiled and said that she had gotten better. She smiled. She hit the guy and said that he was still hard to fight. Arthur looked at them in surprise. He thought that she was a half-elf. Sylvie said that half-breeds were rare. The guy looked at the half-elf. The beast said that before he was distracted by another battle, they should introduce themselves to the captain. Arthur walked forward and said that there was something about close combat that made the battle exciting compared to long-range combat. A guard stood in front of him. Arthur smiled and asked if this was the captain's tent. The man asked what he was doing here. He frowned and repeated his question. Arthur took out a coin. The guard peered at it. Then he looked up and said he was sorry. The guy asked him to be quiet. He said he didn't want to cause a stir with his visit, so let's keep it between them. He walked into the tent and said they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Sylvie smiled and said she remembered her. Glory turned around. She ran up to him and hugged him. She said she was glad to see him and called him General. She smiled and told him to call her Vanessa in response to the guy asking her to call him Arthur. Arthur asked if she would mind giving him a brief report on the current situation. They stood at the table. Glory said that at the moment her division was small. She had 20 experienced spellcasters and 10 ranged enhancers. She said that the rest were fairly capable mages and ordinary soldiers. Glory looked at the map and said that Otter and his division were heading here from Mabon to join up with them. Arthur thought about it and said that he didn't think the ships would sail that far south. The girl said that she heard about his big plan along the coast for those bastards. Did he really think that would work? The guy frowned and said that it would slow them down and with a little luck sink some of their ships. She said that she was sorry that they wouldn't be there to see it. The pink-haired girl smiled and asked if he wanted a sip of alcohol. He said that he was still underage. She said that if he was old enough to go to war then he could drink too. The redhead took a sip. Sylvie asked if it was smart to weaken yourself like that before a battle. He cleared his throat and said that it was just one sip. The girl said that Commander Varian wanted her to make him give a speech to the soldiers to boost their morale. Arthur asked me to wait until Captain Otter arrived. He wanted to have some more fun at the camp. Sylvie looked at him and said that as someone related to him, it bothered her that the entire continent relied on him so much. The guy came out of the tent. The soldier almost called him General. He shushed him. He went to the camp. He approached the knights and asked who won in the end. Cedri raised her hand, to which her partner replied that she had won once out of all the sparring they had. She replied that this was just the first victory of many to come. The guys shook hands. They introduced themselves to each other. Jonah asked if he was a new recruit. Arthur replied that one could say so. He said that judging by the way things were going, they would be able to enjoy even more battles tonight. A group of warriors approached them and said that Cedri had a great fight. She said that she heard. The guy looked at her and said that he knew that all her training would pay off. She thanked him. Jonah looked at her and asked if she was blushing. The girl said that she was just hot. Arthur thought that the new recruits had definitely become friends already. He tilted his head and thought that the two seemed to be bonding well. A man approached them and called Arthur a hillbilly. He cracked his fists and told him to pull his head out of his ass. Arthur looked at him and asked if he really looked like he came from a hillbilly. Cedri stood up and yelled that he should stop picking on the newbies. He needed to grow some balls and compete with someone in his weight class. He said that it was okay and they were just having fun. Herak frowned and said that he just wanted to give the newbie some advice. The guys shook hands and introduced themselves. Suddenly Arthur was pulled forward. The guy swung his fist and advised him not to let his guard down. Everyone looked in shock. The redhead flew away. He lowered his head and asked what was in Vanessa's flask. Herak smiled and said that he was lucky that he held back, otherwise he would have flown away. The guy ran to him and said that the enemies would not coddle him. Arthur grabbed his face, smiled and said that he would remember. Herak flew away. The crowd triumphed. The redhead looked at his fist in surprise and thought that he did not use mana. Why did it fly so far? This guy still needs a lot of work. A girl came up and said that she wanted to kick this guy's ass, but it seems there is no need. She smiled and said that she is used to spear fighting. She would be glad if he used a weapon too. The guy spread his arms and said that the blacksmith was fixing his sword. The girl asked to give him a sword of his size. Someone threw the sword into his hands. Nifia looked at him and asked if he was ready. She attacked. The redhead said that she was a little impatient. The girl attacked and said that he was definitely not some rookie. Arthur blocked the blow and thought that her mana control was simply magnificent, on a completely different level compared to the previous one. He thought that she lacked combat experience. Arthur cut her off. She jumped back. Nifia looked at the people and told everyone to step back. The guy smiled and said, "Just a friendly duel, not a fight to the death." She frowned and said that this was a warm-up for the war that was just around the corner. She put her hand on the ground and said that there were no taboos in war. Pillars began to grow around them, and they fenced off the audience from the fighter. Arthur frowned and said that there were no cages in war either. He remembered that in his past life, he had realized that people would become complacent in the presence of a powerful opponent. He frowned. Arthur rushed forward and thought that the soldiers expected a quick victory when there was someone with the rank of a spear among them or even a warrior with a higher status. He thought that the outcome of wars was decided by duels of kings, the decision of a world scale rested on the shoulders of one man. He thought that the people of all nations lived a detached life without any opportunity to make changes to the current order, but that was how it was in his past life. For these soldiers, having a spear in their ranks would give them confidence in the battles to come. The girl blocked his blow. He thought that with so much mana available, mistakes were more forgivable here than in his past world. Warriors aimed to increase their personal strength, not to correct shortcomings. Even he had made that mistake when he came to this world, until it was knocked out of him by Asura. Someone started knocking. The woman kept knocking and said dinner was ready. Everyone lined up. Nifia closed her eyes. The guy held out his hand and said it was a good fight. She shook his hand and agreed. Cedri yelled at Arthur to hurry up or he wouldn't get any of the stew. Sylvie got out of her cape and said she wanted to eat too. The soldiers were resting. The guys were watching the people having fun. One of them said that Cedri got along well with everyone. Jonah said that she had been like that since she was a little girl, but her family had some problems, so she had to take care of her brothers and sisters on her own. Arthur sat down next to her and asked if that was the reason she joined the army. Because of her family, he confirmed and said that no matter how much he helped her, she hated being indebted to someone. He looked ahead and said that even to him. Arthur looked at him and said that obviously the only thing he could do was join the army and risk his life to protect her, right? He wanted to confirm, but stopped and said that he didn't like her in that way. Red had said that he told me that he liked her. Cedri came up to them and asked, and they managed to become such friends. Jonah shut his interlocutor's mouth and said that they were having a man-to-man conversation. He said that they thought that the enchantress over there was cute. The girl turned away from him and said that she didn't know that he liked long-haired girls. A woman came up from behind and asked how good it was to be young. She said that she had seen his fight earlier and, more importantly, how he left the captain's tent. She put her hand on his shoulder and asked if he would help her shake her old bones. Arthur scratched the back of his head and said that he didn't mind, but maybe he could at least find out who he had already managed to anger. She replied that he hadn't angered her, but had aroused curiosity. She introduced herself as Astra and said that she was an ordinary cook. Arthur looked at her in shock. She smiled. He asked why he found it hard to believe. They prepared for battle. Astra suggested putting on a show for the anxious soldiers before they went hysterical. Arthur sighed. The woman approached him and asked him to go easy on the old lady. His eyes widened in surprise, and he barely blocked her blow. The warrior smiled and said that she guessed she was right. She swung her sword and said that he was the most ordinary guy to me. Arthur dodged her blow. He smiled. Arthur struck and said that he was an ordinary guy, just as she was an ordinary cook. She said that if he was curious, he would ask the soldiers about her. Many of them were her students after all. They continued to fight and Arthur asked if she was a teacher at Xyrus. Astra frowned and said that she would rather swallow a gallon of fire sand than teach at that academy. The red had ducked and said that he used to be a student there. The woman replied that then he knew how arrogant the kids were. He agreed with her. The brunette struck and said that after the war with the elves she decided to teach at the Spear Academy. He replied that it was the best school for anyone who wanted to become an elite soldier. Astra looked at him and said that was true except that after this war the requirements for them were low. Everyone was watching them. The woman told him that since he was so confident in himself, why didn't he decide the winner? Arthur frowned and said that in this war they could use a few more spears in their ranks, whom she could train. He struck and asked what she was doing here as a simple cook. She replied that this story should be told over a few toys of alcohol. She smiled and asked why he didn't stop holding back. Arthur looked at her in surprise. He stopped and said that using any magic other than basic enhancement in such an exciting duel would be disrespectful, and they were just getting to know each other. She replied that those were wise words from one so young. She bared her teeth and offered to show these soldiers things they wouldn't be able to see in class. Mana appeared around her. The onlookers were blown away by the blast. Someone said they would have been thrown out of the class if she had used even a fraction of her power. Arthur smiled. He gripped his sword and thought that 40% of his mana should be enough. Mana appeared around him. The woman smiled and asked what a talent like him was doing here. The ground cracked beneath her as she asked why he would even go to Xyrus with such skill with a sword. She raised her sword to strike. He looked at her and said that he could already handle it. Their swords crossed. Arthur pushed her away and said that he needed to hone his magic. Astra said that she never thought about it. They fought. Arthur looked at her and thought that she fought like a seasoned warrior. Jonah looked at them and said that she never thought that you missed Astra so many times. Cedri widened her eyes and said that she had a feeling that Madame was fighting for her life and death, but Arthur looked like he was barely trying. Arthur's face was calm. He frowned. Astra pushed herself off the ground. He thought that her movements were well thought out. The woman was about to dash. He dodged. Arthur widened his eyes and thought that it was a trick. He barely blocked the blow. His sword began to crack. Astra looked in surprise as the sword was destroyed. Arthur raised his eyebrows. He smiled and said that this was his defeat. She watched him go and said she couldn't accept it. Was it the poor quality of the blade? Arthur approached the soldier and said he would get him a new sword and apologized. There was silence. Someone started clapping. Gloria applauded and said it was a good fight. She said, the show was over but the night had just begun. The girl turned around and said to enjoy this night until the morning. That was an order. Everyone was having fun. One of the knights smiled and said he didn't know she could move like that. They replied that she rarely used her mana in their lessons. He approached them and said it was so hard to dodge their careless swings. They offered him to see how he would perform in a fight with her or that guy, and they would call her right away. The blonde screamed, but his comrade stopped him. Cedri smiled and said she would fight Arthur next time. Jonah picked her up and told her she had won too much. She looked at him and said she believed she could win. He said he believed she could win. Arthur sat alone. He was smiling. Sylvie looked at him and said he seemed to enjoy the fight. He said it was rare to find a worthy opponent, although he thought that would change soon. He thought it would be nice to be an ordinary soldier for a few days, even if only for a short time, to live the same life, to enjoy the little things. He laughed when his beast said she thought the word ordinary did not suit him, but they had been through a lot so they should enjoy the little things. She suggested starting with his impressive fight with Astra. Sylvie held out her paw and asked for the leg of veal. The guy asked after all. That was her whole plan. He handed her the food and said she had done a good job of being quiet today. Arthur smiled and told her to enjoy it. The woman came up to him and said that either she was drunk or he was feeding his cape. Arthur scratched his head and said that he decided to play it for later. They clinked glasses to celebrate that great sparring match. While Arthur was drinking, she said that maybe she was wrong about Cyrus. He said that he had to give credit to his peers and teachers who helped him. Astra laughed and said that he spoke like an old man. The soldier came running and called for the general. Arthur glared at him, who corrected himself and said that he meant sir. Arthur blew out a sigh when he said that Captain Otter had just arrived, but Captain Glory was nowhere to be found. He stood up and said that he would find her. Astra looked at him and said that the soldier had called him general. He confirmed and said that it was his story. He smiled when she said that it sounded like an awesome story. He turned and said that he couldn't tell her sober. They were walking away from the camp. Arthur looked away when the soldier said that Glory wasn't in the camp, but she couldn't have gone far. He looked up and said that she was there. The soldier saw her too. Arthur turned around and said that he would bring her himself. He smiled and said that there was nothing urgent to do, and he was already drunk enough to talk to a stranger. He asked to tell Captain Otter that they would meet him tomorrow morning. The soldier bowed and left. The guy looked up and wondered if they would distract her. Sylvie said that everything was fine. She said that she had to make sure that her beautiful subordinate was okay. Mana began to appear around them, and they soared into the air. Arthur landed next to the girl. He approached her. Glory handed him a flask and asked if he would be back. He asked if the watchman should drink. Glory said it was not for him to say, with his cheeks the color of ripe tomatoes. He frowned and snatched the flask from her. He took a few sips. He wiped his lips and sat down next to her. The girl exhaled and asked him if they could win the war. He replied that they were completely sure of it. Glory looked up when he said that they would do everything in their power to ensure victory. She smiled and said that even though he was half her age, his words brought her comfort. He let his head go when she said that it seemed like he would really do it. Arthur looked ahead and said that he had let many people down before and wanted to make sure it didn't happen again. He looked down when she asked if he meant what happened at the academy. The building was burning. Many were lying injured. Mana was burning around Arthur. Arthur asked what was left of the academy now. He said that Tesha didn't remember much of the events of that day. Curtis and Kathleen were pretending like nothing happened, like they didn't want to accept what happened. Glory, you told him that no matter what happened, knowing about it only hurts him. He looked at her and said that he needed to know. She looked away when he said that he should have asked earlier, but he kept making excuses. The girl frowned. She remembered that day. There were many wounded and dead around. She said that the first one found dead was Dora Drya from the Public Moral Committee. She said that Theo was seriously injured, but he couldn't survive despite the efforts of the healers from the Adventurers Guild. Arthur raised his eyebrows. Glory continued that when she arrived there, Arthur asked what about Ferrith and Claire, did they survive? A bird fell from a branch. Glory said that the elf was badly injured, but he was brought home safely. She looked down and said that Claire's family was as secretive as before. She was told that she was alive, but she didn't know her condition. Arthur lowered his head and said that he understood, at least she was alive. The girl looked at him. She looked away, frowned. She said that Kai was one of the radicals who worked with Draniv and Vritra, but he disappeared along with the rest of the masked lackeys, along with Elijah. Red watched in shock. He clenched his fist when she said that in the end, 5 traitors were caught, but 30 escaped. Arthur thought that knowing the whole truth gave him a chance to think things through. He often found himself forgetting his past life. More and more, the control of his past self was weakening, giving him the opportunity to be whoever he wanted in this world. He thought that right now, he wanted to go back to his old self. Red gritted his teeth. He thought that he wanted to go back to the cold, calculating who had given him all the emotions so much that he was invulnerable. How many more people he knew, or even met today, would end up dead because he couldn't save them? He thought how many would survive this war. Glory said that he couldn't save everyone, but he changed everything. Did he know that? She frowned and said that she had only taught there for a few years, but even she knew how strong people from Zyres were and that everyone would recover from everything that had happened soon, and without him there would be nothing to recover from. He looked at her in surprise when she said that he had saved the school, but he couldn't say that about himself. Arthur frowned and said that it wasn't true. The girl said that she had failed him. She said that when he fell off the cliff in the widow's crypt, she had been completely helpless. She didn't know what to tell her students. She had truly thought that he had died. The commander looked down and said that he was great, he had come back despite everything. She didn't look at him and said that the flames she had seen in him and the other children defending the academy were of a strength she had never seen before. She frowned and said that she had to be strong for the soldier, but she was scared. Sylvie was silent. He mentally addressed Sylvie. The guy looked at her and asked her to do him a favor and stand guard for the night. She agreed and turned into a dragon. Glory looked at her in surprise. Arthur stood up. He extended his hand to her and offered to go. He smiled and said that the night had just begun and her soldiers did not intend to wrap up until the morning as their superiors. It was their duty to join him. The girl stood up. Glory picked up the blanket and said good morning to the general. Arthur jerked and said that as her superior ordered to return the blanket and let him sleep, she said that she could not. The girl threw the cards on him and said that he himself appointed a meeting with Captain Otter for this morning. She left the tent and told him to wash up and read this before coming. Arthur thought how he would manage to do everything in time. Sylvie appeared behind him and said that he had had an extremely unproductive night. The guy was scared. He grabbed his head and asked her to take it easy because his head was splitting. He asked if something had happened. She answered, didn't he remember? She said that she had dragged his drunken carcass here to save him from ill-considered consequences. He smiled. Arthur asked besides this how the night shift had gone, if everything was okay, so she confirmed, said that a thick fog had hung over the western shore. But she hadn't noticed a single enemy ship. She didn't fly lower because she was afraid that she might be seen. The dragon began to sniff him. She said that he needed to wash himself. The guy was walking with a stack of papers. Soldiers were carrying firewood in front of him. Cedric and Jonah froze, and suddenly they stood at attention. Arthur waved to them. He went into the tent. The girl pointed at him and introduced the captain and general. Otter looked at him seriously. Arthur scratched his head and said it was a pleasure to meet him. The captain turned away and said that his army was camped in the cliff forest. It was better to put them together before uniting. The girl bowed her head and said that it would be better to do it as soon as possible. She asked the general how he thought it would be better to divide the army in case of an attack. Otter looked at her and said that to repel an attack from the coast, all the infantrymen should be lined up. Glory said that the general was entrusted with the control of their divisions. The elf looked at him and said that the general was responsible in case of an attack as a mighty spear, but the captains knew their troops best. Sylvie frowned and thought that she was going to hit him. Arthur said that it seemed that his presence was not necessary. He would go find something to eat for breakfast. Glory asked if he had anything to add. He thought for a moment and said that if they wanted his opinion, then concentrating all their forces in one place was not the wisest decision. Otter looked at him and said that they were the last defense of the west from attack by enemy ships. He frowned and asked where in his opinion they should attack from if not from the water. Arthur, without turning around, said that he was trying to maintain decency. As he had already been informed, the Virian commander asked him to come here in case of a worst-case scenario. He turned around and said that this was why he was here, but he did not advise confusing his indifference with the transfer of power into his hands. Arthur looked at him and asked if he understood him. The elf frowned and said yes exactly. The guy came out of the tent and said that he had no task to somehow influence the decision made by the name, so he left it to you. He looked ahead in horror when a scream was heard. Arthur walked towards the soldiers. Everyone looked in horror. A severed hand was flying through the air. She fell to the ground. Arthur shouted at the soldiers to prepare for battle. Everyone ran away. Arthur turned and asked the captain if the weapon in the severed arm was from his camp near the cliff. The old man ran. Arthur grabbed his arm. Otter turned and asked him to let him go. His men were fighting alone there. Arthur looked at him and said that if he went alone and died there, they would put their squad at an even greater disadvantage. The old man shouted if he was suggesting that they be abandoned there to their fate. Arthur turned and said that he was suggesting that they not throw themselves on the enemy's weapons, but join Captain Glory and her warriors who were coming to their rescue. Otter pulled his arm away and ran to the girl. Arthur turned and said that it was not time to play heroes yet. The army moved forward. Arthur thought that instead of marching in one big crowd, the captain split his squad into groups, each consisting of infantry, amplifiers, archers, and spellcasters. He thought of the amplifiers as being on the sides, protecting the spellcasters and archers. Arthur mentally noted that the infantry was in front, ready to take all the damage. Then the squad leader, he followed right behind the infantry, giving orders and protecting the spellcasters. Even though they were close to the borders, this did not look like a man-beast attack. They could be bandits or some radical group opposed to the war. He had a feeling he was missing something. Arthur looked at the woman and asked if she would be okay. She replied that the captain could not have asked for a better amplifier to protect the camp. He said that he would leave them. Astra called him and said that caution is never too much. He replied that he hoped she listened to her own advice. He frowned and told Sylvie to get ready. She asked if it was okay for her to reveal herself so soon. He said he needed to know what was going on and quickly. Arthur told her to stay as high as possible. They would be indistinguishable from birds. They took off. Everyone looked at them in admiration. They soared above the clouds. The dragon said that before they entered the battle, he should know that there was a limit to her interference. Arthur asked if she meant the contract with Azura. Sylvie said that Alder had warned her, but there was still something, because of the awakening that her grandfather made her go through. Arthur looked at her in surprise when she said that until her ethereal powers were fully awakened and she took control of them, her actions would be limited. He smiled and said that he did not know how difficult he would make her train. He should have known about her condition. They flew over the battlefield. Arthur frowned. The knight's head was torn off. A fierce battle was going on. Arthur thought that as a man who had seen the surprises of war, he could consider what had happened a miscalculation, a rather harsh calculation. Arthur flew over the battlefield and wondered how they managed to get here unnoticed. There was not a single ship near the cliff. He frowned and asked Sylvie to go higher. His plans had changed. Arthur asked if she could discreetly track their path to here, find out where they were coming from, and he would join the battle. The dragon looked at him and asked what if something happened to him and she was too far away. He replied that he had a bad feeling even with the glory troops that they would lose this battle even if he intervened. The guy frowned and thought that if he was right, this would not be a simple wall-to-wall war. He said that she was the only one who could fly there and back. Sylvie agreed, but said that if she felt that he was in danger, she would immediately return and take him despite all his indignation. Arthur jumped down and asked her to be careful. Glory pointed her sword forward and said that the squad was going around the left flank. She gave the order to join forces with Captain Otter's troops and attack these bastards head-on. Someone appeared behind her. She swung and stopped the swords at Arthur's throat. He smiled when she said not to scare her like that. She saw how they flew away. What was he doing here? The guy asked how he could leave his precious subordinate here alone. He looked to the side and said that he sent Sylvie on an important mission. She replied that it was damn nice that he was with them. Arthur thought that the bad feeling began to intensify. For some reason he did not understand, he expected their enemies to be similar to Vritra, monsters of evil. He thought that they were no different from their soldiers, except that their clothes were dark gray with red and they also had a fast and powerful spell casting. The guy caught the sword and reflected the enemy's attack. He thought it was an amplifier with a yellow or silver core. Arthur swung his sword. His eyes glowed blue. He struck the enemy. Arthur's eyes widened. He thought, what the hell was that? Armor appeared on the soldier's stomach. He looked to the side and thought that the spell was not his. He saw a mage. His opponent hit the ground. He thought that he had never seen someone control a barrier with such efficiency. The guy retreated and thought that this spellcaster could be a problem. He rushed forward. Force barriers appeared in front of him. Arthur threw the enemy back. He thought why the soldier did not strengthen his body, because he fought like an experienced amplifier, but did not nourish his body with mana. He could be dealt with in a jiffy. Arthur noted his fighting style and thought that this applies to everyone. There is no point in this. He looked around and thought, why were they separated from the others? He thought that it was as if the others simply did not see them, or was this some kind of illusion? The soldier frowned and shouted at the shield to strengthen his entire body. Arthur thought that it was obvious that their battle tactics were completely different from theirs, but why were they using their mana like this? He looked to the side and thought that he needed to learn as much as possible to win this war. He thought that this amplifier was well coordinated, but it was not a match for Cordry. Arthur noted that the enemy looked like an experienced attacker, but why were they using only mana claws? The soldier looked at him and said that he was right and he was no different from a foot soldier. Arthur successfully fought back. He broke the opponent's defense. He turned around and thought that his first move was a feint, but he still managed to recover the real blow, but it seemed that he was tense. Arthur began to attack and thought, why were all the enemies and allies not paying attention to him? He saw fireballs flying at him and wondered where they came from. The redhead broke them with his sword. He pointed forward and asked if he was right that the one he was looking for was there. Arthur threw his sword at him. The magician tensed up. A shield appeared in front of him. The other magician frowned. Arthur turned around and thought that since no one noticed, there was definitely some mind magic and illusions involved. Many soldiers appeared around him and they all asked him if he found it funny. The guy threw up his hands and said that because of all these illusions, he could lose. He looked at them and thought that the mana coming from them was different from the amplifier's mana, so the illusion was created by the shield, not by someone. Everyone rushed to attack. He thought that the amplifier was the main attacker, and the caster supported him from afar. The magician shot a fireball. All the attackers rushed to one point. Arthur thought, Do all the enemy units really act like this in threes? He protected himself from the fire. There was an explosion and he wondered if they allocated a shield for each warrior or only for certain units. Lightning emanated from Arthur's hands. He looked at the enemies and thought that thanks to the fusion everything became clear to him. The soldier looked at his ally and shouted for the shield to protect Malin. He was pierced by lightning. Arthur thought that the battle lasted no more than an hour. The smoke could not hide the smell of blood and burnt flesh. A sword appeared in his hands. He thought that the number of enemies was decreasing, but they had more magicians on their side. It is impossible to learn all the enemies' techniques in one battle. But he managed to learn something. His body itself moved across the battlefield, killing everyone who stood in their way. He remembered that during the entire time not a single word was spoken. Instead of them, screams and howls of animals were heard. Arthur thought that perhaps if people used words for war and not weapons, the battlefields would not be soaked in blood. He thought that as soon as a person takes up a weapon, words become useless. Cedri was being attacked from behind and Arthur thought that the vicious circle was starting again. The girl dodged and hit the enemy. She raised her hand and wondered what Arthur was saying. She couldn't hear him. Cedri turned around and fire pierced her through. Jonah ran to her. He held out his hand and shouted her name. He picked her up. Arthur killed his attackers. Arthur grabbed the guy by the shirt. He looked at him and shouted what he was doing in the middle of a battle. He told him to leave. Jonah looked ahead and told the girl that everything would be fine. A projectile was flying at him. Arthur deflected it. He looked at it and thought that he was completely useless. It was a waste of time trying to shout to soldiers who couldn't hold their own on the battlefield. Arthur remembered the moments with Cedri. He gritted his teeth, knocked out the guy, and carried them both in his arms. Arthur created a shield around himself. He pushed the enemies away with magic. The archers said he couldn't dodge from that distance. Arthur stopped time. He dodged the arrows. The archers looked at him. He held the arrow in his teeth. The woman chopped up the grass. She looked up. Astra froze. Arthur stood in front of her. She asked what happened. He put Cedri and Jonah down and asked him to take care of them. The redhead turned away. The guy asked him why. He grabbed his leg and asked why he couldn't save her. The girl lay with her eyes open. Arthur's mood darkened and he said he couldn't save every soldier in the war. Jonah looked at him and said he could if he wanted to. He was a spear after all. For a second he thought he was sleeping when the arrow hung in the air. Arthur pulled his leg out. He went on and said that his goal was not to save every soldier he met in the war. Arthur screamed that she might not have known him for long, but if she had lived, she would never have thought of him as a simple soldier. Jonah looked at him and called him general. Arthur gritted his teeth. He grabbed Arthur and said that he was sorry for his friend. The redhead looked at him and said that there were enemies far worse than he could imagine. He said that they were stronger than any adventurer he could worship. Did he really want him to waste energy saving every soldier? If he did that, who would stop the enemy leaders who could move mountains with a snap of their fingers? Astra hung her head. Jonah cried and said that he had promised her something when they were children. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he said that he wanted to ask for her hand in marriage. The woman looked at them and said that she would take care of him. Arthur walked forward. After a while, he was running. There was a battle. Arthur turned around when someone called him. Glory was wiping blood from her face. He told her that she looked like shit. She said that such things are not said to ladies, even in times of war. Sylvie said that she was coming back. Arthur asked if she found anything. She said that someone was coming in his direction. Arthur's heart pounded when the dragon said that they were strong. Glory looked at him and asked what was going on. He told her to take the divisions to another place as far away from here as possible. The girl frowned and asked if he meant retreat. He had eliminated almost all the ranged spellcasters and many amplifiers. The enemy no longer had an advantage. Arthur put his hand on her shoulder and said that someone as strong as him or even stronger was coming. He asked to take everyone away so that they would not get caught in their crossfire. Glory's eyes widened. He said that this was the very reason he was here. He suggested avoiding senseless deaths. The girl was silent. She waved her sword and agreed, asking him to return alive or she would pull him out of the afterlife and finish him off herself. She climbed onto her hawk and addressed the soldiers. She screamed for everyone to retreat. The girl looked at the captain. Otter frowned. Arthur looked at the troops and thought that everything was fine. He thought that the enemy soldiers were not a problem. Their divisions would cope. Arthur looked into the forest. He flew from branch to branch. Arthur asked Sylvie if this was the place. She did not answer him. The redhead thought that she must not be very far away as long as she did not ignore him. Suddenly he froze, hearing a strange voice. He turned around and the voice asked him if he was lost. Arthur began to burn. The voice asked him if he was looking for her. He saw movement behind him. The voice said that he had sharp eyes. The unknown was moving and telling him to guess where she was. She appeared behind him and said that she could be anywhere. A hand reached out from right behind him. The girl grabbed his face and said that he could be right here. She smiled and said that he was a very handsome young man. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button for more epic manhwa recaps.